I think too many pastors just naturally jump to the gospel lesson when they're looking for a text to preach on. And obviously it's important to preach on the gospel, to hear the stories of Jesus, to talk about the parables, to retell the old story, as the hymn says, of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. But it's a shame if a pastor consistently skips the Old Testament lesson for preaching on. There's such richness in the Old Testament. There's just by sheer volume of text, there's so much more in the Old Testament than in the Gospels, and certainly in the New Testament. Just the amount of text there. There's also so many different genres in the Old Testament. You know, there's narrative, there's poetry, there's the Psalms, there's songs, there's prophecy, there's historical books. There's just such a richness there that the congregation really should hear, needs to hear. The Old Testament gives the congregation, the parishioner, the context in which to understand the New Testament. To hear the story of the Passover just immeasurably enriches one's understanding of the Last Supper and of Jesus as the figure of the Passover lamb. To hear Psalm 22, "Oh my God, why have you forsaken me?" To hear a sermon on that gives such good context to that moment on the cross when Jesus quotes that psalm. The stories of the Old Testament, the narratives, the prophecy, are our story. Sometimes it's said that we're reading someone else's mail, and that is true to some extent. These, of course, are originally the Hebrew scriptures, the scriptures of the ancient Israelites. But they're our story as well. They're our story by virtue of our having these ancestors in the faith, these spiritual ancestors. And so to hear the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Rebecca and Ruth and Esther tells us more about our own stories, tells us how God is in relationship to us, just as God was in relationship to these ancient peoples, and how we can see God at work in the world. And again, provides us the context with the context to so much of the New Testament. Because these were the scriptures of Jesus. These were the scriptures of the disciples, the first disciples. When they speak of Scripture, when they speak of the law and the prophets, they're speaking of the Old Testament. So we need to be paying attention to those texts as well in our preaching and teaching.